The war ended in 1945. That is the date most people hold on to. May 8th, 1945 in Europe, September 2nd in the Pacific. Those are the dates printed in textbooks, carved into monuments, cited in speeches. And they are accurate dates. The fighting did stop. The formal instruments of surrender were signed. The guns went quiet in a way that could be measured and recorded. But the war did not end the way most people imagine endings work. The systems did not stop. The paperwork did not stop. The freight did not stop moving. And somewhere in the mountains of Lower Silesia, in a tunnel carved through solid rock by men who were not paid and were not expected to survive the work, a train sat in the dark. It sat there for 70 years. That is not a metaphor, it is a logistical fact. The discovery of what witnesses and researchers came to call the Nazi gold train became international news in 2015 when two men, one Polish and one German, filed a formal legal claim with Polish authorities stating that they had located a train hidden in a tunnel near the city of Walbzik, in what had been the German province of Lower Silesia. They claimed the train was armored, that it stretched for approximately 100 meters, and that it contained valuables including gold, weapons and artworks looted from across occupied Europe. They wanted a finder's fee of 10% of whatever was recovered. The claim was filed through official channels, reviewed by official bodies, and reported by every major news organization in the world within days. The story spread because it sounded like the end of an adventure film. Hidden treasure, secret tunnels, 70 years of silence finally broken. But that framing, that cinematic framing, is precisely what made the story easier to consume and harder to understand. Because the train, if it exists, and the evidence for its existence is substantial though not yet fully confirmed, is not an anomaly. It is not an outlier. It is not the exception to how the war was conducted. It is the clearest surviving physical symbol of how the war actually functioned, which was as a bureaucratic, logistical, highly organized operation for the systematic transfer of wealth, labor, and life from the occupied to the occupiers. To understand the train, you have to understand the system that built it, loaded it, and hid it. Germany in the 1930s was not a country that had abandoned modernity. It was a country that had fully embraced it. The Nazi state was a state of forms and procedures, of offices and departments, of ledgers and receipts and chain-of-command communications. When the regime decided to strip Jewish citizens of their property, it did not do so through random looting. It did so through law. The law for the restoration of the professional civil service in 1933. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935. The November pogrom of 1938 was followed by a fine levied against the Jewish community as a collective, officially designated as damages for the disorder the community was blamed for causing. The fine was 1 billion Reichsmarks. It was collected. It was recorded. It went into government accounts. That is important. The money was recorded. The records were kept. This pattern, the pattern of formal legal and bureaucratic procedure applied to what were in practical terms acts of organized theft and violence, continued and expanded as Germany occupied more territory. In Poland, in France, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in Greece, in Yugoslavia, in the occupied Soviet Union, the same basic process repeated. Laws were passed or decrees were issued. Property was inventoried. The inventory was reviewed. Transfer documents were prepared. Shipments were arranged. Receipts were issued. Everything moved through channels that left paper trails. The Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the operational staff named after Alfred Rosenberg, was formally established in 1940 to oversee the systematic seizure of cultural property from occupied territories. It had a staff. It had offices in multiple countries. It produced reports. It tracked shipments. It issued directives. It was, in the organizational sense, an institution, and it functioned the way institutions function, through hierarchy, through standardized procedure, through the accumulation of documented decisions made by individuals who understood their role as professional rather than personal. By the time the war reached its final phase, the ERR had catalogued and seized hundreds of thousands of artworks, books, religious objects, and cultural artifacts. These were not taken chaotically. They were taken systematically, with attention to provenance where provenance served the purpose of the seizing authority, and with careful documentation of where objects had come from and where they were being sent. In Paris alone, the ERR operated out of the Jeu de Paume Museum, which became a processing center and temporary storage facility for confiscated art. An art historian named Rose Valland worked there as a museum employee and secretly documented what was coming in and going out, recording destinations and inventory numbers over a period of years. She did this at personal risk. She survived. Her records later helped trace thousands of stolen works. But the reason her records were useful was that the German records were also meticulous. The thieves had filed their paperwork. This is the bureaucratic reality that the story of the hidden train grows out of. Not individual greed, though there was plenty of that. Not chaos, though chaos existed in certain contexts. But organized, documented, procedurally executed transfer of wealth on an industrial scale. The territory of Lower Silesia, which is today southwestern Poland, was German in 1945. It had been German for centuries, known as Niederschlesien, containing the city of Breslau, which is now Wrocław, and the smaller city of Waldenburg, which became Wałbrzych after the war when the German population was expelled and Polish settlers brought in. The region was mountainous, industrially developed, and in the final years of the war, it became increasingly important to the Nazi regime as the Eastern Front collapsed, and territories closer to the front became untenable for sensitive operations. Heinrich Himmler, as head of the SS and later as Reich Commissioner for the Strengthening of German Nationhood, oversaw a project that has been referred to by researchers under the name Riese, which means giant. Project Riese was one of the largest construction projects of the Second World War and one of the least publicly known. It involved the construction of a network of tunnels and underground facilities in the Owl Mountains, the Soe Gori, in Lower Silesia. The stated purpose of the project shifted over time and was never fully transparent even within the regime. Some sources describe it as an intended underground headquarters for Hitler. Others describe it as a manufacturing complex for weapons production. Others suggest it was intended as a vast underground storage and administrative facility. What is not in dispute is the scale of the project and the human cost. The labor force for Riese was drawn almost entirely from concentration camp prisoners, primarily from the Gross-Rosen camp system, which was one of the largest camp networks in the Reich and which had dozens of subcamps dispersed across Silesia. Estimates of the total prisoner labor force used in the construction of the Riese tunnel system range from approximately 13,000 to over 20,000 individuals. The death toll among that labor force was massive. The work was underground, in conditions of extreme physical stress, with inadequate food, inadequate clothing, inadequate medical care, and with the ever-present reality of brutal punishment for failure to meet production quotas. The tunnels were dug by hand and by blast. Prisoners moved rock. They built concrete forms. They laid rail. They died. When they could no longer work, they were removed. When they died at the worksite, they were removed. The project continued. The paperwork that governed the project treated the labor force as a category of resource, denominated in units of productive capacity, managed through the same administrative systems that managed cement and timber and rail and explosives. No tunnel system in the Riese complex was fully completed before the war ended. The Red Army's advance through Poland in early 1945 was faster than German planners had anticipated. In January 1945, the Soviet Vistula-Oder offensive pushed German forces back across Poland with a speed that disrupted logistics across the entire eastern sector. Silesia became a theater of active combat. Breslau was declared a fortress city and held under siege until the very end of the war in May. The civilian German population was fleeing west. The administrative machinery of the regime was in various stages of collapse, evacuation and concealment. It is in this context that the legend of the gold train first enters the historical record. There are multiple testimonies gathered in the years and decades after the war that describe a specific train, or trains, loaded with valuables and dispatched westward from Breslau and the surrounding Silesian territory in the final weeks before the Soviet arrival. The testimonies come from a range of sources: German railway workers, SS men who participated in loading operations, Polish and German civilians who witnessed convoys, former prisoners who were used as labor in loading operations. The testimonies do not agree on every detail. They agree on the basic shape of events, that valuables accumulated in Silesia over years of looting and wartime banking operations were consolidated and moved, and that at least one train ended up hidden in a tunnel in the mountains rather than being successfully evacuated westward. The valuables in question were not uniformly gold in the literal sense, though gold in the literal sense was certainly present. The Nazi state had accumulated gold through multiple channels. It had seized gold from central banks in occupied countries. It had collected gold from confiscated Jewish property, which included gold jewelry, gold coins, gold dental work, and gold bullion from those wealthy enough to have held it. This last category requires explicit acknowledgement because it was among the most systematically collected and documented streams of wealth seizure in the entire war, and because its collection was integrated into the operations of the concentration camp system in a way that made the processing of human beings and the processing of their possessions parts of a single administrative procedure. When prisoners arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau or Treblinka or Sobibor or any of the other killing facilities, their property was taken. This was documented. The property was sorted. The documentation noted categories of items, currency in various denominations, jewelry by type, watches, eyeglasses, shoes, catalogued by size for reuse, hair, collected and bundled for industrial use in the production of felt and yarn, gold dental fillings and crowns, extracted after death and before cremation, collected in quantity sufficient to require regular smelting operations to convert them into bullion that could be processed through the banking system. The SS Main Economic Administrative Office, the WVHA, handled the financial flows from the camps. Its accounts received the proceeds from camp labor, from camp recovered property, and from the extracted gold. The gold from dental work went, after smelting, to the Reichsbank. It entered the financial system. It became fungible. It became part of a reserve that financed the war. This is not speculation. This is documented in the Nuremberg trial records, in the post-war investigations of the Reichsbank, in the captured records of the WVHA. The gold existed. The accounts existed. The transfer documents existed. The system worked. It was efficient. It treated mass murder as a production process with byproducts that had monetary value, and it managed those byproducts with the same administrative attention it gave to any other category of war-related resource. By late 1944 and early 1945, significant quantities of this consolidated wealth were physically located in Silesia. The Reichsbank had dispersed gold reserves away from Berlin as Allied bombing increased. Artworks and cultural property had been moved to underground storage facilities in Silesia and elsewhere in the Reich's interior. Looted property from the eastern territories had been sorted and stored in facilities across the region, and the tunnel network being constructed under Project Reese represented, among other things, potential storage capacity for objects the regime did not want captured. The historical record becomes less precise from this point, not because events stopped being documented, but because the documentation was actively destroyed. In the final weeks of the war, SS officers and administrative personnel burned records across the Reich. At Auschwitz, the administrative block was partially burned before the evacuation. At Gross-Rosen, documents were destroyed. At Berlin, the destruction of records was systematic and ongoing until the regime's final hours. The Reichsbank moved its gold reserves to the Merkers mine in Thuringia, where American forces found them in April 1945, but not all reserves were at Merkers. What happened to the contents of the Silesian storage facilities is not fully established in any single authoritative document because the documents were burned. What survives are the testimonies, the circumstantial evidence, and the physical reality of tunnels that were built for purposes that were never completed. Waldemar Filik was a Polish man who worked as a laborer in the Wałbrzych area after the war. In testimony given in the 1960s, he described conversations with former German railway workers who claimed to have been involved in loading operations near Waldenburg in February or March of 1945. According to these accounts, boxcars were loaded with crates at a railway facility. The crates were moved into a tunnel section near what is now known as the Książ Castle complex. The castle itself having been taken over by the SS as a command facility, and the tunnel entrance was sealed. The workers were told the loading operation had not taken place. That final detail is worth pausing on. The workers were told the loading operation had not taken place, not that it was classified, not that they were bound by secrecy. They were told it had not happened. This is a specific kind of institutional instruction, the instruction to reorganize one's memory around an administrative fiction, and it was common enough in the operations of the Nazi state to be unremarkable as a procedural matter. Personnel were routinely instructed to have not seen or done things that they had seen and done. The institutional fiction was the operating reality, and contradicting it was dangerous in ways that made compliance rational. The Książ Castle, known in German as Schloss Fürstenstein, has its own complicated role in the Riese project, and in the broader story of what happened to Silesian valuables in the final months of the war. The castle, one of the largest in Poland, sits above a network of naturally existing and artificially expanded tunnels. The SS undertook renovation and expansion work on both the castle and its tunnel system, beginning in 1943. Interior rooms were demolished, tunnels were reinforced and extended. An elevator shaft was dug connecting the castle's lower levels to the underground facilities below. The work was performed by forced labor. The stated purpose of the Książ renovations was to create a command headquarters, potentially for Hitler, potentially for the Army High Command. Whether this was ever the actual intention or whether it was a cover purpose for something else is not resolved. What is established is that significant construction was undertaken, that it was never completed, and that the castle and its tunnels were evacuated by German forces in the weeks before the Soviet arrival, with departing personnel leaving behind evidence of recent activity but no clear documentation of what had been stored or removed. Polish and Soviet investigators who arrived in the area after the German evacuation found the castle largely emptied of portable valuables. They found evidence of the construction project. They found sealed passages. They did not find any comprehensive inventory of what had been there. The Soviets conducted their own searches of the tunnel systems in the area in 1945 and 46. What they found and what they removed is not a matter of public record because their investigations were classified and their findings, whatever they were absorbed into Soviet administrative channels that were not transparent. This is one of the layers of silence that accumulated around the question of the Silesian treasures. The German records were burned. The Soviet investigations were classified. The Polish communist government, which took over the region after the expulsion of the German population, conducted its own searches, but was limited in what it could publicize by both practical constraints and political considerations. A Polish government publicly searching for Nazi treasure in the 1950s was navigating a Cold War political environment in which such searches could be framed in multiple inconvenient ways by various parties, and in which any discovery would immediately create complex questions about ownership that the government was not well positioned to resolve. So the tunnels were mapped partially, they were searched partially, they were documented partially, and the question of what was in them remained officially open and practically ignored for decades. The physical geography of the area around Wałbrzych is important to understanding why the tunnel theory has remained plausible across 7 decades of investigation. The Owl Mountains, the Soigori, and the surrounding Sudeten ranges are heavily mineralized terrain that was industrially significant for most of the 19th and 20th centuries. The area contains coal deposits, which were mined from the medieval period onward. It contains mineral deposits of various kinds. It contains natural cave systems and karst formations, and it contains, overlaid on all of this natural and industrial geology, the artificial tunnel system created by Project REES, of which only a fraction has been fully explored and mapped. The total length of tunnels constructed under Project REES across the 7 construction sites that constituted the project is estimated at somewhere between 40 and 90 kilometers, depending on how you count passages of different sizes and stages of completion. Many of these passages were sealed at the end of the war, either by demolition or by simple closure with debris. Some were sealed by collapsing the entrance with explosives. Some collapsed naturally over the decades. Some have been opened by researchers and explorers and found to be empty or nearly empty. Some have not been opened. The local culture in Walbrzych and the surrounding villages has preserved a tradition of stories about hidden tunnels, hidden trains, and hidden treasure for the entire post-war period. This tradition is not dismissed by serious historians. It is treated as a category of evidence, oral history attached to specific places, transmitted across generations, reflecting something about what people actually saw and heard and understood in the months of chaos and evacuation that ended the war in this region. Some of these stories are certainly embellished, some are certainly confused or conflated, some may be substantially accurate. The specific claim filed in 2015 by Andreas Richter and Piotr Koper, the German-Polish pair who announced they had found the train, referenced a combination of oral tradition, their own physical exploration of the area, and what they described as ground-penetrating radar evidence, suggesting a large metallic object at depth in the area of the railway line near Walbrzych. The Polish authorities took the claim seriously enough to mobilize a formal investigation, which involved the military, archaeologists, geophysicists, and historians. The investigation used multiple scanning technologies. The results of those investigations were, in the technical sense, inconclusive. They did not find a train in the specific location identified by Richter and Koper. They found geological anomalies consistent with underground voids. They found evidence of historical construction activity. They did not find a confirmed train. The Polish military announced in 2016 that their investigation had not confirmed the existence of the train in the claimed location. This did not end the story, for several reasons. First, the investigation was limited to specific areas and used technologies with known limitations in this type of terrain. Second, subsequent independent investigations using different methods have continued to produce anomalous results, consistent with large underground structures in the area. Third, the historical record supporting the general thesis that valuables were hidden in the Silesian tunnel system in early 1945 is strong enough that the absence of a confirmed location does not constitute evidence of absence. And fourth, the area is physically very large. The tunnel network is incompletely mapped, and several sections remain sealed and unexplored. The Książ Foundation, which administers the castle and the connected tunnel system, has continued archaeological work in the area. Polish researchers affiliated with universities and independent research organizations have published work examining the historical and geological evidence. The question is genuinely open. But the question of whether the specific train exists in a specific location is, in some ways, the least interesting part of the story. The more significant questions are about what the story reveals, what it illuminates about the functioning of the system that would have produced such a train in such a place. Consider the logistical chain that would have had to function for a train to end up hidden in a Silesian tunnel in February 1945. Someone would have had to decide what was being loaded. Someone would have had to authorize the loading operation. Someone would have had to arrange for the railway equipment, the locomotive, the cars, the fuel. Someone would have had to clear the track. Someone would have had to coordinate with the tunnel facility. Someone would have had to direct the labor of loading. Someone would have had to decide to halt the train in the tunnel rather than continue its planned westward journey. Someone would have had to seal the tunnel, and all of these someones would have been operating within a chain of institutional command, following orders, filling roles, doing their jobs. At every point in that chain, the individuals involved would have understood to varying degrees what they were handling. The gold, if it was there, had a history. The crates contained objects that had been taken from people who had been killed or whose property had been seized under laws specifically designed for that seizure. The individuals loading those crates onto those trains in February 1945 had not personally killed anyone in most cases. They were stevedores, railway workers, SS administrators. They were doing their jobs at the end of a very long institutional process that had begun years before with legislation and census records and property surveys and deportation schedules. This is the point where the story of the hidden train connects to something larger and more difficult than treasure hunting. The train, if it exists, is a physical record of a system of looting that was integral to the Holocaust and to the conduct of the war more broadly. The objects on that train, whatever they are, represent the accumulated material outcome of policies that stripped millions of people of everything they owned as a prelude to, or concurrent with, stripping them of their lives. The legal and institutional framework for this stripping was constructed gradually and was presented at each stage as a legitimate exercise of state authority. In Germany, between 1933 and 1939, the stripping of Jewish citizens was accomplished through a series of laws that removed their professional licenses, their citizenship, their right to own property, their ability to operate businesses, their access to public spaces. Each law was passed by a legislature or promulgated through executive authority. Each law was published in the official gazette. Each law was administered by the existing civil service, which was largely retained from the Weimar period and which adapted its operations to the new legal requirements. The civil servants who administered these laws were not all committed ideological Nazis. Many of them were career bureaucrats who had served under previous governments and who would have described their work in purely professional terms. They processed applications. They reviewed claims. They issued decisions. They filed documents. The content of what they were deciding or filing was the systematic impoverishment and exclusion of a portion of the population, but the form of their work was the standard form of administrative procedure. This normalization of extreme action through bureaucratic form is one of the most significant and least examined aspects of how the Nazi regime functioned. The historian Raoul Hilberg, in his monumental study of the destruction of the European Jews, devoted considerable attention to what he called the machinery of destruction, and he noted the degree to which the implementation of genocide was accomplished not through the creation of an entirely new institutional apparatus, but through the adaptation of existing institutions to new purposes. The railway system that transported prisoners to the killing centers was the same railway system that transported freight and passengers. The banking system that absorbed looted wealth was the same banking system that handled commercial transactions. The civil service that administered anti-Jewish legislation was the same civil service that administered every other aspect of government. The German state railways, the Reichsbahn, is a particularly important example. The Reichsbahn was not an SS organization. It was a government department with a staff of hundreds of thousands, with timetables and route maps and billing departments and maintenance schedules. When it was tasked with transporting prisoners to the killing centers, it did so through its normal operating procedures. Transport requests were filed by the RSHA, the Reich Security Main Office, which was the SS body coordinating the deportations. The Reichsbahn processed these requests like any other group transport request. Cars were allocated, timetables were set, fares were billed at the standard group rate, with a return fare billed for the guards, who would return, and a one-way fare billed per head for the deportees, who would not. The billing department issued invoices. The invoices were paid. The Reichsbahn's role in the Holocaust was not the result of a decision made by fanatical ideologues. It was the result of a series of administrative decisions made by transport officials who understood their job as the management of rail traffic. They managed this traffic. They did it efficiently. The deportation trains ran on schedule more often than not. When there were scheduling conflicts between deportation trains and military supply trains, the conflicts were resolved through the standard interdepartmental coordination process. Sometimes the deportation trains won, sometimes they did not. It was a resource allocation question. The same institutional logic applies to the final phase of the war in Silesia. By early 1945, the German administrative apparatus was in various stages of functional collapse, but it had not ceased to function. Orders were still being issued and followed. Resources were still being allocated. The movement of valuables out of threatened territories was a legitimate military and administrative priority, and it was organized and executed through the remaining institutional channels. Gauleiter Karl Hanke, who was the Nazi Party regional leader for Lower Silesia, and who had remained in his post as the Soviet advance began, was issuing orders in January and February 1945 that covered a range of administrative matters, including the evacuation of valuables. He was, by this point, operating in conditions of considerable chaos, but he was still operating, still issuing orders, still receiving reports. The organizational machinery was degraded, but not stopped. The specific operational details of what was moved, when and to where, in the last weeks of German control of Silesia, are incompletely documented precisely because the people who would have documented them were simultaneously trying to evacuate and to destroy evidence of their activities. But the general picture that emerges from the available evidence is of an organized, if frantic, attempt to move and conceal assets rather than allow them to be captured by the Soviets. The fear of Soviet capture was not simply about losing wealth. It was also about losing the evidence that wealth represented. The origin of the gold and valuables accumulated in Silesia was traceable to varying degrees to the looting and genocide that had produced it. German officials evacuating these assets were not merely saving property. They were also, consciously or not, suppressing evidence of crimes. There is a specific episode in the story of Silesian valuables that is documented and that illustrates the connection between concealment and evidence destruction. In late 1944 and early 1945, the SS undertook operations to exhume mass graves across the Eastern Territories as the front retreated. This was Sonderkommando 1005, an SS unit tasked specifically with destroying the physical evidence of mass executions. Teams of prisoners, supervised by SS guards, dug up the mass graves, burned the remains, crushed the bones, and reburied or scattered the ash. The prisoners who performed this work were themselves killed afterward. This operation was motivated explicitly by the desire to prevent the documentation of crimes. The same institutional logic, destroy the evidence before it can be captured, applies to the movement and concealment of looted wealth. The valuables and the victims' remains were both categories of evidence, and both were treated as problems to be managed through institutional procedure. The Soviet forces that arrived in Silesia in late January and February 1945 were moving through a landscape that had been subjected to this kind of evidence management. Mass graves had been partially destroyed, records had been burned, valuables had been moved or hidden. The physical landscape retained evidence of events in the form of tunnel systems, sealed passages, disturbed earth, but the documentary landscape had been deliberately damaged. The subsequent Soviet investigation of the Silesian tunnel systems was itself not transparent. Soviet trophy brigades operated across the occupied territories, collecting artworks, scientific equipment, and other valuables for transfer to the Soviet Union. This was partly restitution for Soviet losses, which had been enormous, and partly straightforward appropriation. The trophy brigades operated under military orders, and their activities were classified. What they found in the Silesian tunnels, if anything, has not been fully disclosed. There are Polish researchers who have spent decades documenting what the Soviets removed from Silesia. The picture that emerges is of substantial removals, significant enough to account for some portion of what was stored in the region, but not obviously sufficient to account for all of it. The gaps in the accounting, the difference between what should have been there based on pre-war and wartime records and what is documented as having been recovered or removed, leaves space in the historical record for significant quantities of material that have not been accounted for. This accounting gap is itself evidence of a kind, though it is not the same as the direct evidence of a sealed tunnel containing a train. The accounting gap demonstrates that the system of looting was large enough and the documentation thorough enough in some areas, chaotic enough in others, and actively destroyed in still others, that a final reckoning is genuinely difficult to construct. Historians of the Holocaust's economic dimension, including Gerald Feldman, Martin Dean, and others, have spent careers trying to trace the flows of looted wealth and have concluded that complete documentation is impossible because too much documentation was destroyed. But the work they have done establishes the scale of what was taken. From France alone, the ERR removed approximately 22,000 objects of cultural and artistic value. From the Netherlands, approximately 50,000 stolen artworks have been identified. From Poland, the losses in cultural property, beyond the impossible-to-count losses in Jewish property of all kinds, included items from the Royal Castle in Warsaw, from the Czartoryski collection, from museums and churches and private collections across the country. The Czartoryski collection's most famous missing item is Raphael's portrait of a young man, which was in Krakow when the Germans arrived in 1939 and has not been seen since. It is not on any list of recovered objects. It is not known to be in any private collection. It is on a list of missing things. The list of missing things is very long. Much of what was missing in the years immediately after the war was recovered in the decades that followed through the work of national monuments offices, through the restitution claims process, through the investigations of agencies like the Art Loss Register, through the voluntary and involuntary disclosures of private collectors who had acquired looted objects. Much of this recovery work relied on the meticulous records kept by the thieves themselves, the ERR inventories, the transport manifests, the auction records from state sales of confiscated property. But a substantial portion of what was taken has never been recovered. Not because it was destroyed, though some was, but because the chain of custody was broken in the chaos of the war's end and the subsequent political divisions of Europe, which put different portions of the Nazi archive and different portions of the European museum landscape under the jurisdiction of governments with different interests and different levels of transparency. Poland's situation is particularly complex. As the country that experienced both Nazi occupation and Soviet occupation, with German expulsion of Poles and Polish expulsion of Germans following the war's end, and with borders that shifted by over 200 kilometers to the west, Poland contains within its current territory the physical landscape of several different histories simultaneously. The area around Wałbrzych, which is now a declining post-industrial city in southwestern Poland, was until 1945 a German city in a German province. The people who lived there were expelled. The people who moved in had a different language and a different history and a different relationship to the physical space they now occupied. The tunnels beneath the Owl Mountains were dug by prisoners who were neither German nor Polish in most cases. They were Jewish, Czech, Hungarian, Soviet, from across occupied Europe. The tunnels themselves were part of a German project. The land above them is now Polish. The history below them belongs to everyone who was part of it, and to no one in particular. This is the geography of the hidden train story, not just in the physical sense, but in the historical sense. The train, if it is there, sits in the middle of multiple histories, multiple claims, multiple silences that have accumulated for 70 years. The legal questions around a potential discovery are not simple. Poland is a signatory to the 1970 UNESCO Convention on the means of prohibiting and preventing the illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural property, and to subsequent European frameworks on restitution of looted art. If the train contains artworks with identified original owners or their heirs, those claims take precedence under international law. but identifying the original owners of objects that have been in a sealed tunnel for 70 years, after the documentation has been partially destroyed and the original owners in many cases murdered along with their families, is an enormously difficult practical task. Germany has formal mechanisms for restitution claims, including the Deutsches Zentrum Kulturgutverluste, the German Lost Art Foundation, which maintains a database of lost cultural objects and processes restitution claims. Austria has similar mechanisms. Poland has its own restitution framework. But these mechanisms depend on documentation, on claimants, and on surviving objects that can be matched to documented losses. For the Holocaust specifically, the combination of mass murder, document destruction, and geographic displacement creates a situation where many losses can be documented, but claimants cannot be identified because the claimants are dead and left no heirs who survived. There is gold in this story that has no owner, not because it was never owned, but because the system that took it also killed everyone who owned it. The broader history of Nazi looting and post-war recovery efforts makes this concrete. The gold recovered by American forces at the Merkers mine in April 1945 included a portion that could be identified as central bank gold looted from Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and other occupied countries. That gold was returned, through the Tripartite Gold Commission, to the countries from which it had been taken. But another portion of the Merkers gold was identified as having come from sources that could not be returned to a national government because it had not come from a national government. It had come from individuals. It had come from concentration camp victims. It had come from the systematic stripping of people who had been murdered. That gold, described in the historical literature as non-monetary gold or victim gold, was held in a complicated legal limbo for years after the war. Eventually, a portion of it was distributed through the Jewish Restitution Successor Organization and similar bodies to surviving Jewish community institutions and to Holocaust survivors. But the process was slow, contested, and incomplete, and it depended on political negotiations among governments rather than on the restoration of specific property to specific people or their heirs. This is what happens to property when you kill everyone who owns it. The legal framework for ownership depends on living owners or identifiable heirs. When a system of mass murder eliminates both the owners and, in many cases, the entire family line, the property enters a kind of historical no-man's land where legal claims are difficult to establish and where the practical resolution tends to favor whoever has physical possession. The Soviet Union's trophy brigades operated on essentially this principle, though framed in terms of war reparations. They had physical possession, and they kept what they took. Some of it was eventually disclosed and is held today in Russian state museums. Some of it was never disclosed and remains in storage or has been lost within the Russian archival and museum system. The Amber Room, which was the most famous of the objects removed from Leningrad's palaces and taken to Königsberg, the city now called Kaliningrad, has never been recovered, and its fate is unknown, though theories range from destruction in the bombing of Königsberg to concealment in a sealed facility somewhere in the former East German or Polish territory. And yes, some theories place it in the tunnel system near Walbersich. The Amber Room was created in the early 18th century for the Prussian King Frederick I and was given to Peter the Great of Russia, becoming one of the treasures of the Tsarskoye Selo Palace complex near Leningrad. When German forces captured the area in 1941, an SS task force disassembled the Amber Room and packed it into crates for transport to Königsberg. It was installed in Königsberg Castle in 1942. After that, the documented record ends. The castle was damaged in Allied bombing in August 1944 and largely destroyed in fighting in April 1945. Whether the Amber Room panels survived the destruction of the castle, and if so, where they went, is not established by any document that has been made public. A replica of the Amber Room was constructed over a period of more than 20 years by Russian craftsmen and unveiled at Tsarskoye Selo in 2003. The replica is beautiful and historically informed. The original has not been found. These large-scale disappearances, the Amber Room, the portrait of a young man, the contents of institutions across occupied Europe that were looted and never recovered, exist in a context that includes thousands of smaller disappearances that are no less significant for being less famous. The family silver of a household in Lodz, the library of a scholar in Vilna, the Torah scrolls of a synagogue in Thessaloniki, the savings of a lifetime held in a bank account that was seized and liquidated. These losses are individually documented in some cases, in testimony given after the war, in claims files, in post-war surveys. They are invisible in the sense that they do not generate treasure-hunting headlines. The hidden train story generates headlines because it is a concrete, physical, locatable thing. A train is a thing that either exists or does not. A tunnel either contains something or it does not. This concreteness is what makes the story attractive to media and to the public, and it is what makes it somewhat misleading as a frame for understanding what happened in Silesia and across occupied Europe in the 1930s and 40s. The real scale of the looting was not a single train hidden in a single tunnel. The real scale was the systematic extraction of wealth from an entire continent's Jewish and other minority populations over a period of more than a decade, managed through institutional channels, documented in the records that survived, and only partially recoverable because so much of what was taken from people who were then killed, and because so much of the documentation was then destroyed. The tunnel near Wolbesisch is a symbol that functions better than it functions as a factual finding. It functions as a symbol because it is visible, because it is located in a specific place that can be visited, because it connects the abstract fact of the looting to a concrete object, a train, sitting in the dark, not found, not accounted for, not resolved. But the history it symbolizes is not hidden. It was documented in the records that survived. It has been researched by historians who have spent careers on it. It has been partially acknowledged in the legal frameworks that emerged from the post-war period, in the restitution processes that have recovered some portion of what was taken, in the national memorials and international institutions that have made it part of the official record of the 20th century. The official record is incomplete. The restitution is incomplete. The accounting is incomplete, and the tunnels under the Owl Mountains remain partially sealed and partially unexplored. To understand the hidden train, you have to understand the Reichsbahn, not as a villain, but as a machine. The Reichsbahn, Deutsche Reichsbahn, was the state railway, and it was enormous. It employed over 500,000 workers in wartime. It managed tens of thousands of locomotives and hundreds of thousands of freight and passenger cars. It ran on timetables. It was divided into directorate regions, each with its own administrative apparatus, its own maintenance depots, its own accounting. The Breslau Directorate, which covered Silesia, was a regional division with all of this infrastructure. When the RSHA filed transport requests for the deportation of Jews from Silesia, those requests went to the Breslau Directorate for processing. The traffic desk allocated cars, the scheduling desk set departure times. The billing desk issued invoices. The trains ran. When those same tracks were needed for the movement of valuables in early 1945, the operational logic was the same. Someone filed the request. Someone allocated the equipment. Someone coordinated the schedule. The train moved. The railway workers who drove those trains and the administrative staff who scheduled them were, in the main, not ideological militants. They were workers. They were doing their jobs. The man who drove the train into the tunnel in February 1945, if that is what happened, drove it the same way he drove any other train. He followed his orders. He put the locomotive into the tunnel. He may or may not have known what was in the cars behind him. He almost certainly did not ask. Asking was not part of his job. His job was to drive the train. This is the quality that made the system function. Not fanaticism, though fanaticism existed in certain positions and certain units. Not exceptional cruelty, though exceptional cruelty existed in certain places. But the ordinary human capacity to do a job without fully confronting what the job is part of, to be a link in a chain without attending to where the chain begins or ends, to follow procedure, because procedure is the frame within which professional existence makes sense. The sociologist Zygmunt Bauman, in his work on the sociology of the Holocaust, described this capacity as an essential feature of modern bureaucratic organization. The division of labor, the specialization of function, the physical and psychological distance between individuals and the ultimate outcomes of their actions, these are features of industrial modernity that make large-scale coordinated action possible. They are also features that make large-scale atrocity possible by distributing moral responsibility across so many individuals that no single person experiences their contribution as decisive. The man who drove the train did not load it. The man who loaded it did not make the decision about what to put in the crates. The man who packed the crates did not write the orders authorizing the operation. The man who wrote the orders did not make the policy that created the stockpile. The man who made the policy did not individually strip a single Jewish family of their property. Everyone was following someone else's order. Everyone was doing their job. This distribution of action across institutional roles is why the Nuremberg trials, for all their historical importance, were in a certain sense an inadequate response to what had actually happened. The trials focused on individual criminal responsibility, on the decisions of specific leaders and commanders. They convicted and executed specific men, but the system that those men led could not be put on trial, because the system was a system, not a person, and because millions of people who were part of the system were still alive after the war, and would need to be incorporated into the post-war societies being reconstructed in Germany and elsewhere. The denazification process in occupied Germany was ambitious in conception and limited in execution. Approximately 3 million cases were reviewed. The vast majority of those reviewed were classified as Mitläufer, followers, and released with minimal consequences. A smaller number were classified as Belastite, incriminated, and faced penalties including fines, restrictions on employment, and loss of certain rights. A still smaller number faced more serious consequences. But the fundamental structure of the German state, its civil service, its legal profession, its banking system, its industrial corporations, was reconstructed using many of the same personnel who had operated it under the Nazi regime. The Reichsbahn, specifically, became the Deutsche Bundesbahn in West Germany, with significant continuity of personnel at the managerial and administrative level. The men who had processed the deportation transport requests in the 1940s were, in some cases, processing freight requests in the 1950s in the same administrative buildings. The transition was not marked by any particular ceremony. The forms changed. The header on the letterhead changed. The work continued. This continuity of institutions and personnel is not a secret. It has been researched and documented by German historians, particularly in the wave of academic work that emerged in Germany from the 1980s onward, when a generation of historians began asking questions about their parents' and grandparents' institutional roles in the Nazi period. This body of work, sometimes described as the Historikerstreit period and its aftermath, produced detailed studies of specific institutions, the foreign ministry, the judiciary, the medical profession, the universities, the major industrial corporations, and their continuity across the 1945 divide. What this research showed, in aggregate, was that the dividing line of 1945 was much more permeable in institutional terms than the official post-war narrative had suggested. Germany's post-war reconstruction as a democratic state was genuine and largely successful, but it was built partly by people who had operated the previous regime, in roles that ranged from peripherally to centrally involved in its crimes. The train in the tunnel, if it is there, is a physical remnant of a system that was otherwise largely absorbed, processed, and continued. The gold and the artworks, and whatever else might be in those sealed cars, represent the residual material trace of a massive institutional operation that was in other respects folded into the post-war order. The people involved are mostly dead. The institutions they served have been transformed or reconstituted. The legal frameworks have changed. The political geography has changed. The survivors and their heirs have been waiting, in some cases for 70 years, for a final accounting that has not come. The 70 years of silence around the Walbrzych tunnel is not simply the silence of physical concealment. It is also the silence of institutional continuity, of political complexity, of Cold War divisions that made certain inquiries inconvenient, of legal frameworks that could not fully address what had happened, because the frameworks themselves were the product of the same system of state sovereignty and institutional order that had enabled the looting in the first place. The Allies knew about the looting. They had captured records. They had testimony. They had the evidence gathered for the Nuremberg trials. They knew, in broad terms, what had been taken and roughly where it had gone. The post-war restitution effort was real, but it was also limited by political decisions about how much disruption the Allied powers were prepared to sustain in the interest of returning stolen property to its rightful owners. Art looted from private Jewish collectors in France, for example, was returned to France. If the original owners could not be identified or were dead without heirs, the property went into French public collections. France's national museums hold objects whose provenance is documented as Nazi-era confiscation, but whose original owners have never been identified or whose restitution has been blocked by various procedural and legal obstacles. This is not a secret. The French government commissioned a report on it in the 1990s and has been working through the backlog of claims since then. The work is ongoing and incomplete. Germany's own restitution framework has returned thousands of objects and resolved thousands of claims since the 1990s. The German Lost Art Foundation database contains entries for over 600,000 objects. A fraction of these have been returned. Many remain unresolved. New claims are filed regularly as archival research continues and as heirs trace their families' losses through newly accessible records. Austria was slower to engage seriously with restitution, and when it did so, it was partly in response to international pressure, following the controversy over the portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer, known in popular culture as the Woman in Gold, which was held by the Belvedere Museum in Vienna and was the subject of a restitution claim filed by Maria Altmann, the niece of the painting's original owner. After years of legal proceedings in both Austrian and American courts, the painting was returned to Altmann in 2006. It was subsequently sold at auction for more than $135 million, a figure that reflected not only the painting's aesthetic value, but the legal and historical significance of what it represented. The Woman in Gold case was exceptional, in that it involved a painting famous enough to attract sustained media attention and an heir with the resources and determination to pursue the claim through decades of legal proceedings. Most looted objects are not famous. Most original owners did not have heirs with comparable resources. Most claims are not resolved. This is the background against which the hidden train story plays out. It is not a story about a single dramatic discovery. It is a story about the last unresolved physical trace of a system of looting that was, in most of its other manifestations, already partially addressed, partially absorbed, and partially buried under the administrative sediment of 7 decades. The men who reported the train's location in 2015 were not historians. Piotr Koper is a Polish businessman. Andreas Richter is a German engineer. Their claim was motivated, they said, by a deathbed confession from a man who claimed to have been involved in the loading operation in 1945. This kind of deathbed testimony is a recurring feature of stories about hidden Nazi-era assets. There is a logic to it. The people who were directly involved in the concealment of valuables in the final months of the war were young men in 1945 who lived into old age. As they reached the end of their lives, some of them spoke about what they had done or seen. Some spoke to family members. Some spoke to journalists. Some filed formal statements. These testimonies are not uniformly reliable. Memory over 7 decades is subject to distortion, embellishment, and the unconscious influence of the very legends and stories that had accumulated around the subject. A man who spent 70 years knowing he had been part of something significant, something that people were still looking for, would have had ample time to elaborate or reshape his memory of the experience. This does not mean the testimonies are worthless. It means they have to be treated as one category of evidence among several, corroborated where possible against documentary and physical evidence. The documentary evidence for significant concealment operations in Silesia in early 1945 is solid. There are multiple independent testimonies pointing to the same general area and the same general time period. There are physical tunnels that were constructed for purposes that were never completed and that have not been fully explored. There are accounting gaps in the documented holdings of the institutions that stored valuables in the region. There is a pattern of evidence consistent with something having been hidden. The physical evidence from the scanning investigations of 2015 and 2016 was ambiguous rather than negative. The ground-penetrating radar surveys found anomalies. The investigators could not confirm that those anomalies were a train. They also could not confirm that they were not. The technology used has known limitations in the type of layered industrial and natural terrain that characterizes the Walbrzych area. In the years since the initial investigation, Polish researchers have continued work in the area. The Książ Castle tunnel system has been subject to ongoing archaeological investigation that has found evidence of activity consistent with the general historical account. Some sealed sections of tunnels have been opened and found to contain evidence of hastily abandoned construction and storage activity, including materials left in conditions suggesting rapid departure. None of these investigations has produced the definitive confirmation that would settle the question. The question may not be settled in the near future. The terrain is difficult. The resources for comprehensive investigation are limited. The political will to commit sustained resources to what is, in official terms, an unconfirmed hypothesis has fluctuated with the news cycle and with Polish domestic politics, which have their own complicated relationship to the history of German occupation and post-war settlement. There is also a question of what a confirmed discovery would actually mean. The practical and legal implications of finding a sealed train in a tunnel near Walbrzych would be enormous. The contents would have to be catalogued. Provenance would have to be researched for each object. Claims would have to be accepted or rejected. Disputes would have to be adjudicated. The process would take years and involve multiple jurisdictions and multiple legal systems and multiple international frameworks that do not always align cleanly with each other. None of this would be simple. None of it would be fast. None of it would be, in the end, fully satisfactory, because the people whose property was taken are dead, and because the full restoration of what was taken is not possible, and because the legal frameworks available are imperfect instruments for addressing what was not simply theft, but theft as part of an organized program of genocide. The Polish government has stated on multiple occasions that any discovery in the Walbrzych area would be subject to Polish law and international restitution frameworks. The German government has acknowledged Poland's jurisdiction over the area's physical territory while noting its own commitment to restitution principles. Jewish organizations and international Holocaust research institutions have stated that any recovered assets with connection to Holocaust victims would need to be addressed through appropriate restitution channels. These statements are correct and responsible. They are also, in the context of 7 decades of incomplete accounting, somewhat abstract. The gap between the principle that stolen property should be returned to its rightful owners and the practical capacity to identify those owners and execute that return is a gap that has not been bridged in 70 years of effort, and it will not be bridged by finding a train. The train is a symbol. Train is, if it exists, and the evidence suggests something is there, it is a symbol of the physical persistence of the past in a present that has tried, in various ways, to process and move on from what happened. The sealed tunnel is the war that did not fully end. The contents of the cars, whatever they are the accounting that was never completed. There is another dimension to this story that receives less attention than the treasure hunting angle, and it is the dimension of the workers who built the tunnel. Project Rees consumed thousands of lives. The prisoners from Gross Rosen who dug those passages are not famous. They are not individually memorialized in most accounts of the project. Their names are not, in most cases, recorded in any accessible archive, because the records of prisoner labor were among those destroyed at the war's end. What is known is the structure of the system. Prisoners were transferred from the main Gross Rosen camp to subcamps established near the construction sites. Gross Rosen itself was a granite quarry camp from its establishment in 1940, and the use of prisoner labor for construction projects in the region was continuous from that point. The subcamps for Riese bore names like Wolfsberg, Wustergiersdorf, Erlenbusch, Tannhausen, and others. Each subcamp had its own internal administrative structure, its own SS garrison, its own prisoner population. The mortality rate in these subcamps was very high. Construction underground in difficult geological conditions with inadequate equipment, inadequate food, and the constant application of violence to maintain production pace produced a high casualty rate from accident, exhaustion, starvation, and direct killing. Prisoners who could no longer work were removed, which in the camp system meant transfer to a facility where they would be killed, or direct execution at the worksite. After the war, very few survivors of the Rees subcamps were available to testify because very few had survived. The evacuation marches of early 1945, which moved prisoners from the eastern subcamps westward as the Soviet advance accelerated, were themselves murderous. Prisoners too weak to walk were shot. Columns were marched in winter cold with no food and no shelter. The death toll on the marches was comparable in percentage terms to the death toll in the camps themselves. The Gross Rosen camp was evacuated in stages beginning in late January 1945. The main camp held approximately 60,000 prisoners at the time of the evacuation. The evacuation was chaotic and lethal. Prisoners who survived the marches arrived at camps further west in conditions of extreme physical deterioration. Some were at Bergen-Belsen, which was liberated by British forces in April 1945, in conditions of catastrophic overcrowding and starvation. Some arrived at Dachau or Buchenwald or Mauthausen. Many did not arrive anywhere. The history of what the Rees tunnels cost is measured in these deaths. It is not measured in any monument at the site, because there is no monument of appropriate scale at the site. There is a memorial at Gross Rosen itself, now a museum in the Polish town of Rogoznica, and there are smaller memorials at some of the sub-camp locations. But the tunnel system itself, which tourists can visit in portions that have been opened to the public, does not announce with sufficient clarity that it was built by people who were killed for building it. This is a pattern repeated at many sites of Nazi-era forced construction across Europe. The physical objects, the tunnels, the buildings, the fortifications, survive in landscapes that have been reused, repurposed, and integrated into the post-war geography. Their survival is largely a function of the fact that concrete and stone are durable and that demolition is expensive. The human cost that produced them is present in the historical record, but not always visible in the physical space. The Führer's bunker complex in Berlin was demolished after the war, and the Führer bunker itself was sealed and eventually built over. The physical suppression of that site was an intentional decision about how to manage a symbolic space. The Rees tunnel system was not suppressed. It was simply not prominently memorialized. It became a curiosity, a tourist attraction in some sections, a subject of treasure hunting speculation in others. The deaths that produced it became a historical footnote to the treasure story rather than the central fact. This inversion, the foregrounding of the treasure and the backgrounding of the human cost, is a common feature of how the Nazi looting story is told in popular culture. The Monuments Men, the team of Allied art recovery specialists whose work became the subject of a Hollywood film, are celebrated as heroes of cultural preservation. The people whose property was looted and who were killed partly because they owned it are present in these stories primarily as victims, as the passive background against which the heroic recovery effort plays out. The reality of the Monuments Men was more complex than the heroic narrative allows. Their mandate was the protection of cultural property, not specifically the restitution of looted Jewish property. The distinction mattered. Cultural property belonging to national governments was a priority for recovery. Cultural property belonging to private Jewish families was in a more complicated category under the legal frameworks of the time. The eventual return of objects to national museums in France or the Netherlands was easier to arrange than the return of objects to individual Jewish claimants or their heirs, because national museums could sign receipts and provide clear legal title, while individual Jewish heirs often could not be identified or located. This is not a criticism of the Monuments Men as individuals. They operated within institutional frameworks that were themselves imperfect. The point is that those imperfect frameworks shaped the outcome of the restitution effort in ways that continue to matter decades later. The Washington Principles on Nazi-Confiscated Art, adopted in 1998 by 44 nations, established a non-binding commitment to address pre-1945 looting of Jewish cultural property. The principles called for the identification of Nazi-looted art, the search for the pre-war owners and their heirs, and just and fair solutions, which the principles deliberately left undefined. The vagueness of just and fair was a political accommodation to the reality that different states had different positions on what restitution required. Since 1998, the work under the Washington Principles has produced real results. Thousands of objects have been returned. National databases have been created and connected. Research has been funded, claims processes have been established, but the work is not complete and the commitment is not legally binding, which means that states that find compliance politically or financially inconvenient can slow walk or obstruct without legal consequence. The European Commission has, at various points, encouraged more vigorous implementation of the Washington Principles and related frameworks. Individual cases have been litigated in national courts across Europe. The German government has, since the early 2000s, made restitution a genuine governmental priority in ways it was not in earlier decades. Progress has been made. Progress has not been completed. The accounting is still incomplete. The train, real or symbolic, is still in the tunnel. The Reichsbank records that survived capture by Allied forces are held in archives in Germany and in the United States. The captured German records include documents that trace the flow of looted gold into the Reichsbank's accounts, the transfer of those accounts into foreign exchange and purchases, and the eventual disposition of reserves. These records are not complete. Documents were burned before capture. Documents were never created because certain transactions were conducted informally. Documents were created and then classified by the post-war governments that acquired them. The Bank for International Settlements, the BIS, which is the central bank for central banks based in Basel, Switzerland, was a conduit during the war for the movement of looted gold into the international financial system. The BIS continued operations throughout the war, maintaining relationships with the central banks of all belligerent nations. Nazi Germany used the BIS to exchange looted gold for foreign currency. This was known during the war to Allied officials who raised concerns about it. The concerns were managed diplomatically. The BIS continued operating. After the war, an Allied investigation of BIS wartime activities was conducted. The investigation confirmed that the BIS had processed Nazi gold, including gold with documented origins in looted central bank reserves. The BIS board, which included American, British, and European representatives, declined to dissolve the institution. The BIS continued operating and continues to operate today, having since undergone various governance reforms. The wartime chapter is a documented part of its institutional history. Switzerland more broadly played a specific role in the Nazi financial system that was the subject of major post-war investigations, and in the 1990s, a renewed round of scrutiny that produced the Bergier Commission report. The Bergier Commission, an independent historical commission appointed by the Swiss government, concluded that Switzerland had been complicit in laundering Nazi gold. that Swiss banks had held dormant accounts belonging to Holocaust victims without making adequate efforts to identify the account holders or their heirs, and that Swiss refugee policy had turned away Jewish refugees at the border in ways that amounted to complicity in their subsequent fate. The Bergier Commission report was thorough, documented, and damning. The Swiss government accepted its conclusions and entered into a settlement with Jewish organizations that produced a fund of approximately $1.25 billion for distribution to Holocaust survivors and for other purposes. The settlement was reached in 1998. Whether it constituted adequate restitution is a question that different people answer differently. Sweden, Spain, Portugal, and Turkey, all of which maintained trade relationships with Nazi Germany that included the purchase of looted gold for strategic materials, were also subjects of post-war and 1990s-era investigations. Each case is different in its details and in the extent to which the countries in question have acknowledged and addressed their wartime roles. None of these investigations is complete in the sense of having fully traced all transactions and fully addressed all claims. The global financial system's involvement in the laundering of Nazi-looted gold is a story that does not have a dramatic physical anchor the way the hidden train story does. It does not have a tunnel you can visit. It does not have the possibility of a dramatic discovery that would resolve 70 years of uncertainty. It is a story told in ledgers and banking records and diplomatic cables and commission reports, and it requires sustained attention to follow. The hidden train story is more accessible because it is concrete and physical. A train is a thing. A tunnel is a place. The possibility that something real and tangible survived intact in a sealed underground space for 7 decades is compelling in a way that abstractions about international banking and wartime finance are not. But the train, if it is there, did not get into the tunnel through a spontaneous act of nature. It got there through a system. That system processed gold through central banks and international financial institutions. It processed artworks through ERR offices and auction houses and private dealers. It processed human beings through deportation trains and camp administrations and killing facilities. And it produced, in the tunnels under the Owl Mountains, whatever is there now, as a physical residue of all of that processing. The war in Silesia ended in the spring of 1945. Breslau held out under siege until May 6th, 2 days before Germany's formal surrender, in what turned out to be a militarily pointless defense that destroyed much of the city and killed large numbers of civilians. Gauleiter Hanke, who had imposed the defense, fled the city on a personal aircraft in the final hours of the siege. He was never tried for his role in the defense or in the broader administration of the region. He was killed by Czech partisans in the Sudetenland in June 1945 under circumstances that are not fully documented. The German population of Silesia, approximately 3 million people, was expelled in the months after the war under the terms of the Potsdam Agreement, which authorized the transfer of German populations from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary to the remaining German territory. The expulsion of the Silesian Germans was conducted over a period of approximately 2 years and involved considerable violence, death from starvation and exposure, and the loss of everything the expelled population had owned. The expelled Silesians lost their homes, their land, their businesses, their buried property, their family graves. They arrived in post-war Germany as refugees. This is a historical fact that exists in complicated relationship to the history of what the Nazi regime did in the same territory to the populations it classified as enemies. The Silesians who were expelled were, as a population, complicit to varying degrees in the Nazi administration of the region. They were also, individually, people who had been born in the place from which they were expelled and who lost everything when they were removed from it. Both of these things are true simultaneously. The post-war geography of Silesia, which became part of Poland, is a geography shaped by these overlapping histories of occupation, expulsion, resettlement, and loss. The Polish families who settled in Wałbrzych and Wrocław and the surrounding cities came from eastern Poland, from cities like Lwów and Wilno that were themselves incorporated into the Soviet Union after the war. They had their own experience of expulsion and loss, having been removed from the homes their families had occupied for generations. They arrived in places that were, in physical terms, German cities, and they made those places their own over the following decades. The tunnel system under the Owl Mountains was part of the landscape they inherited. It was an unfinished project, a sealed mystery, a subject of local stories that mixed historical fact with legend. For the children and grandchildren of the Polish settlers, the tunnels are not primarily a German story. They are part of the landscape of the place where they grew up. The German citizens who grew up in West Germany after the war inherited a different relationship to this history. The official policy of denazification and the construction of a democratic state included, gradually and imperfectly, an acknowledgement of what the Nazi regime had done. This acknowledgement developed over decades. In the 1950s, the dominant mode was suppression. In the 60s, the Eichmann trial and the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials forced more public confrontation. In the 70s and 80s, the generational shift brought more active engagement with the past. In the 90s, reunification and the opening of East German archives added new dimensions to the accounting. Today, Germany has, compared to most countries that participated in or enabled the Nazi system, a relatively robust culture of historical acknowledgement. Holocaust education is mandatory in schools. Memorials are prominent in public spaces. The legal framework criminalizes Holocaust denial. Restitution is a stated governmental priority. None of this undoes what was done. All of it represents a genuine institutional effort to process a history that cannot be reversed. The effort is genuine, and it is incomplete. The train is still in the tunnel. The Polish investigative team that conducted the most comprehensive recent investigation of the Wałbrzych area published its findings in a series of reports between 2016 and 2018. The lead investigator, a geophysicist named Janusz Madej, concluded that the scanning data was consistent with the presence of a large metal object in the indicated area, but that confirmation would require physical excavation. The recommended excavation has not been fully funded or authorized. The cost of a comprehensive excavation in the area indicated by the scanning data is estimated at several million euros. The Polish Ministry of Culture, which would be the relevant authority for such a project, has not committed those funds. The local government in Wałbrzych has expressed support for investigation, but lacks the resources for a project of this scale. Private investors have expressed interest, but have been unable to reach agreement with the relevant authorities on the terms of any potential discovery-sharing arrangement. This last point, the finder's fee question, returns the story to its most pragmatic dimension. Richter and Koper filed their original claim in 2015, requesting 10% of whatever was found. The Polish authorities declined to commit to any specific finder's fee formula before a discovery was confirmed. The negotiation over terms has contributed to the slow pace of comprehensive investigation. There is something almost mundane about this, a potential discovery of major historical significance held up partly by disagreement over a finder's fee, and it is exactly the kind of procedural, administrative, institutional friction that characterizes how large historical questions actually play out in the real world. The resolution of what happened to the looted wealth of Europe does not look like a dramatic revelation. It looks like a funding negotiation and a legal dispute about jurisdiction. This is appropriate in a grim way. The creation of the problem was procedural and institutional. The resolution is proceeding in the same register. The physical geography of the Rees Tunnel complex is available to researchers and to the public in a way that the administrative geography of the looting was not. You can go to Wałbrzych. You can visit the open sections of the Siaz Castle tunnels. You can stand in passages that were built by people who were worked to death. You can look at the raw concrete walls and the unfinished chambers and the sealed passages beyond the tourist zones, and you can understand, physically, that this project was enormous and that it was never completed and that it held secrets that have not been fully revealed. This is not catharsis. It is just geography. The broader history of the Second World War, seen from the perspective of its administrative and institutional dimensions rather than its military and political dimensions, is a history of systems that worked. The transportation system worked, the financial system worked, the administrative system worked, the camp system worked. These systems did what they were designed to do with a degree of efficiency that is, in retrospect, the most disturbing feature of the period. Not the irrationality of hatred and violence, though hatred and violence were present, but the rationality, the procedural correctness, the bureaucratic competence with which systematic mass murder and systematic mass theft were conducted. The historians who have studied this most carefully, Hannah Arendt with her concept of the banality of evil, Hilberg with his analysis of the machinery of destruction, Bauman with his sociology of modernity and the Holocaust, have all pointed to the same fundamental observation that the Holocaust was not the product of a pathological social system that had broken with modernity. It was the product of a modern social system that had been directed toward pathological ends. The tools were modern. The procedures were modern. The organizational forms were modern. What they were organized to accomplish was genocide. The train in the tunnel is a residue of that modern system. It is there, if it is there, because the system worked. The loading was done. The documentation was prepared. The train was dispatched. The concealment was executed. The system functioned to the point of concealment, and then the system ended, or rather changed form, and the train was not retrieved. The war ended in the sense that the fighting stopped, and the documents were signed. The systems did not end. The financial system continued. The institutional systems continued. The administrative personnel continued in many cases. The legal frameworks were modified but not replaced. The world that emerged from the Second World War was built partly from the wreckage of the war and partly from the institutions that had conducted it, adapted and reformed and redirected, but not destroyed. And in the tunnel, in the dark, in the mountains of Lower Silesia, in what used to be Germany and is now Poland, in the ground under a region that has been occupied by 3 different national administrations in the lifetime of people who are still alive, the train sits. Its contents are not confirmed. Its precise location is not confirmed. Its existence is a strong inference from multiple lines of evidence, but not a proven fact. 70 years of silence. 70 years of incomplete accounting. 70 years of restitution processes that recovered some portion of what was taken and left the rest unresolved. 70 years of institutional adaptation that processed the personnel and the organizations of the Nazi state into the post-war order without fully confronting or accounting for what those institutions had done. The sealed tunnel is not an anomaly. It is the most literal remaining expression of a concealment that was conducted at every level, in ledgers and archives and diplomatic frameworks and institutional continuities for the same period. The question of what is in the tunnel is a real question. The question of what to do with what is there, who owns it, how to document it, how to account for it, how to return it to people or their descendants when the people were killed and the descendants in many cases cannot be identified, that question has not been answered in 70 years and will not be answered by whatever comes out of the ground when the tunnel is finally opened. In 1945, the German state ceased to exist in its Nazi form. The successor states, the Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic, inherited the territory, the institutions, and the liabilities of the predecessor. The legal succession was imperfect and was subject to decades of dispute. The moral succession was not claimed by anyone in explicit terms. The debt was acknowledged incompletely, addressed incompletely, and continues to be processed in courts and archives and restitution offices in countries across Europe and beyond. The train is one item in a very long account.